Let's sew the Dione dress. I am super excited about this one. It is available now on my website and in my Etsy shop, and I hope you enjoy making this elevated yet super comfortable dress. So let's get into it. Before I get into the step-by-step instructions of how to sew the sewing pattern, I do want to talk to you about the stretch percentage of your fabric. So if you've worked with patterns that require stretch fabrics before and you're familiar with this, feel free to skip ahead. But if not, I do want to talk about the stretch percentage gauge that is included in the sewing pattern instructions. So this gauge is a guide to calculate how much stretch percentage your fabric has. Now keep in mind, this is different than just the fabric composition, and it's going to change from fabric to fabric. So you can't just read the fabric composition online to figure out what the stretch percentage is. For this sewing pattern, you need fabric that has at least a two-way stretch of 20% fabric. All of the fabric that I've used is a four-way stretch with 20%. So two-way or four-way will work depending on if you follow the cut layout or not. If you're a person who doesn't follow cut layouts and you want to use the least amount of fabric possible, meaning that you're laying the pattern pieces however you want on the fabric, you're definitely going to need a four-way stretch fabric to achieve that. But you can sew this dress with a two-way stretch fabric of 20%. So you're going to take your 5-inch strip of fabric and you're going to stretch it gently as far as it will go over the percentages, and wherever you land, that is about how much stretch percentage your fabric has. So it's really important that you're working with a fabric that has around 20% as it impacts the fit of the garment. I've got all my fabric cut out here, and I bought all of the fabric for each of my samples from Zaloof Fabrics, I think that's how you say it. And the first version that was red, where I did all the pattern testing, that was a stretch crepe fabric, and this lilac kind of color and the blue sample were made out of a stretch scuba. So with all that being said, let's dive into sewing the Dione dress. It's a little bit difficult to see, but the first step is to create both of your darts on the front two pieces. So we're looking at the wrong side of my front bodice, and I'm just going to pin those darts together to prepare them for sewing. I always like to start with the outer by pinching that together and placing my first pin and working my way in. And I like doing this with pins because I can stick the pin through and make sure that it's going right through the markings that I've made. Looks a little crazy right now, but I'm going to repeat that for my other front bodice piece. Okay, with those all pinned in place, I'm going to take them to the machine and we're going to sew them up. I'm going to sew my first dart here, and it's really important that you work from the outer edge to the inside edge of the dart, and you're going to backstitch on the outer edge of the dart, but you're going to hand tie the darts off on the inner part of the dart. That's how I was taught to sew darts. And what that does is it helps you get a more flat, less pointy inner dart. And I always put my pins back in their home so I don't step on them. So I just sewed right up to the inner edge of the dart. And now I'm gonna raise my needle and take, I like to leave a little bit of a long tail there. And then you just hand tie off. And I like to do this 3 or 4 times and trim your threads. And now I'm going to repeat that for the other 3 darts. And with all our darts sewn, we're going to set these aside and get to work on assembling the back pieces. I have all my back pieces here. So it's a total of 4 pieces, because remember, we're working on the main bodice and the lining bodice at the same time. So you're just going to take each piece and put them right sides together. And I know it's a little bit hard to tell with this fabric. Just be extra sure that you've properly labeled your right sides and your wrong sides. With a lot of the knit fabrics, it's difficult to tell which is the right side and which is the wrong side. And to be honest, sometimes it's arbitrary. You can kind of just pick which one's your favorite and go from there. But I've got my back pieces right sides together, and we're going to sew the center back seam. Center back seam, it's the seam that is opposite the arm opening. And if you want, you can pin these together. I know a lot of us skip pinning, but just for the sake of this tutorial, I will pin these seams that we are going to be sewing. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I am just going to use my serger to sew all my seams when I can, because I think it's really easy. But if you don't have a serger, or you feel like you want your seams to be more reinforced, you can simply use a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine, making sure that you have a stretch fabric needle in there, or you can sew straight seams if you're using the Metler, I think it's called the Seriflex thread. I haven't used it before, but I have a ton of sewing friends who absolutely swear by it. But for today, I'm just going to use my serger to sew that center back seam and just rip right through it. So I've got all my pattern pieces here for my bodice. I've got my front darts all sewn and I have my back bodice assembled. One pair is going to be used for the main fabric and one pair is going to be used for the lining. So we're getting ready to sew up our side seams. If all of your fabric pieces look exactly the same, then you're kind of good to go. But if your fabric kind of has a wrong side or right side, then you will want to determine which is going to be your main fabric pieces and which is going to be your lining fabric pieces, and mark them appropriately. Because now what we're going to do is sew together our side seams, and then in the next step, when we start assembling these straps, it's going to be important to know which you want to be on the inside, which you want to be on the outside, which is actually more important when it comes to the skirt portion now that I'm thinking about it. But anyway, we are going to sew up our side seams for the bodice pieces now. It's time to put the back pieces right sides together with the front pieces, and that is so we can sew up the side seams. And you may just have to take your time when you're pinning things because these fabrics are very slippery. Take your time if you need it. And I always like to pin my darts down. So see how the dart is pinned down as opposed to up? That is how this pattern was designed. And it's really important that the point of the front bodice meets with the edge of the back bodice. So sometimes your fabric can shift while you're cutting things out, and if it's nothing too drastic, honestly, you could just trim that to be the same point, and that'll just make things easier when you are attaching the skirt. You just don't want to be trimming so much that you're changing the general overall shape of this curve, or else your dress just might not be the right length. So I'm going to repeat that again. I've got my front bodice, doing it the other way, just so you can see. And for these pieces, you know, I really don't always pin things. When I pin things, it's mostly on camera to show you what I'm doing. These pieces, I'm just gonna check and make sure that they match in length, close enough, and we're gonna sew. Now remember, we're just doing the side seams. You'll notice my serger does not have a blade, and that is because I accidentally sewed over a pin that I didn't know was there, and it broke the blade. Here we go, sewing up the side seams. Now it is time to assemble the straps. You can set the bodice aside, and honestly, this is like one of my favorite little design details. I love the tiny straps that go over the shoulders, and these are so easy to make. This is definitely going to be an area that you may find you like the straps a little longer, you may like them a little shorter. It depends on your fabric, how heavy it is. If you tend to be using a really, really heavy fabric, you might want your straps a little bit shorter. You may find that they're stretching with all the fabric as the dress is being worn. If you also feel that your straps are being stretched out and they're just not staying up as you would like them to, I would recommend taking bra channeling. That is the channeling that they use in underwire on bras, and it's a lot more stable than something like elastic, and you can sandwich that in between the strap, and that will help the dress not stretch as much. So we're gonna take these, put them right sides together, and just sew some little tubes and then turn them to the right side. So I just stitched these right sides together, and I'm going to use a loop turner. I guess I could put it in front of my forehead. I feel like a beauty influencer. It's really tiny. Has this little piece, and that helps you catch the edge of the fabric to turn it to the right side. If you don't have one of these, you can simply just use a safety pin. So you just insert it, put the little hook, and then you just pull down. You do have to be a little bit gentle with it. And then you have your strap turned to the right side. There we go. Boom. So now you have your two straps. We're going to attach this to whichever bodice you have assigned to be your lining pieces. So I have my lining piece facing me with the right sides facing me, and I'm going to take each strap, and I find it really hard to press this fabric. It just doesn't keep a press. So for this seam, I tend to place it on the outside instead of trying to get it to lay flat. I find that I keep it from rolling around more when I place the seam toward the outside. So I'm just taking my strap and pinning that in place on the front. I'm going to repeat that for the other side. Again, I have that seam facing outside, or facing toward the armhole, I should say. And that's pinned in place. And now you need to very carefully pin this edge to the back piece, making sure that the straps don't get twisted. So we're going to take this edge, and I'm just going to fold it over to the back here and pin in place. And you can see there's no twisting in the strap. And it's okay if you accidentally sew it twisted. Take your seam ripper and undo that. But we're going to take this strap and also pin it in place. There's no marking for this step because honestly, I'm truly just lining it up with the edge of the bodice. So now I'm going to use a straight stitch and baste those straps in place. And you can see I'm back at my sewing machine, and that's just because I find working for this step to be much easier on my machine than on my serger. And sometimes it's a little bit hard for the feed to move the fabric through. And when that happens, I never want to put my finger under here because you don't want to run the risk of stabbing yourself. So I use a seam ripper to get in there. I do not like to sew over pins. And now you have all your straps in place. Now that we have one bodice piece fully assembled, this is a great point to stop and check the fit of your bodice if you did not sew a test version. In the very beginning of the pattern, I always say, please sew up a test version. I know I skip it all the time, but when it's something that I've made, I'm always gonna recommend you do that to help save you on your maybe expensive fabric or your favorite fabric that you didn't wanna ruin. So this is a good point to pause and try this on and make any fit adjustments if you need it to be smaller. Thankfully, this is stretchy, so hopefully if it needs to be bigger, it's close enough for you. But if you find that it's too big, you can take this apart, and you do have a couple different areas where you can troubleshoot taking away fabric. The darts, if you need more fitting around the bust area, you can make the darts bigger. If you need more fitting around the waist, you can remove from the side seams, and then you also have the center back seam that you can take away from. So those are 3 different areas that you can reduce fabric to help get the dress more tightly fitting, if that's what you're going for. Just be careful that you don't make it too tight to where you can't stretch it onto your body, because there is no zipper on this dress. So whatever fit adjustments you make to your lining, go ahead and also make those for your main fabric piece. And otherwise, we're gonna keep sewing. We're going to assemble the main and get these straps all nice and hidden. You are definitely going to want your pins for this next step. So I have my lining piece here and my main piece here. The lining piece needs to be inserted into the main piece, right sides together. So my lining piece is right sides facing me. My main piece is wrong sides facing me. And I am going to take the lining piece and put it inside the main piece and pull that through. And I kind of like to match everything up kind of best I can and give it a good shake, and that kind of helps you handle the fabric. And sewing this together is a little bit tricky, I won't lie to you. See how that strap is really short, and it makes it a little bit difficult to pin all the way around. So I'm actually just gonna start by pinning the front here. That's okay, sometimes a pattern, in order to make a design work, you just have to manipulate the fabric until you have what you need. I'm gonna do that again for the back pieces. So you can see here, it would be too difficult to pin up the underarm portion. So that's why I'm just doing the front and I'm just doing the back. I'm just going to have to very carefully manipulate the straps out of the way. When it comes time to sew the underarms, I like to leave my needle dropped into the fabric so that I can lift the presser foot and rotate the fabric. And I'm just tucking that strap out of the way and continuing to sew. So you could see there was lots of pulling and manipulating that I had to do since the straps are short, and it kind of leaves you with this weird mess. But I promise that once you turn it to the right side, everything will be nice and neat, and you can tuck that in and you have a nice clean finish on the neckline and the straps. You can set aside the bodice for now because it is time to get to work on the skirt. Now these pieces are huge, and this one is in fact upside down, and that is why I think it is so important that you make the tiny little mark on the front skirt, because when I hold this in front of the camera, you kind of can't tell what's going on here. And then if I hold up the back skirt piece, same thing. It's really hard to tell the difference between these two. The first thing that we need to do is we need to sew up the side seams of our skirt, right sides together, before we can stitch the gathers to attach it to the bodice of the dress. It's time to sew our gathering threads, which is either your favorite or your least favorite part, but either way, you're going to sew 2 rows of basting thread around the top of the dress. Now, some people will do 1 row for gathering, but please do 2. I have friends who even do 3. You really need at least 2 to really control the gathers and evenly distribute them throughout the dress. When you do 1 with this heavy of a fabric, it's just not gonna look great. So do 2. The first row is 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, and the second row is another 1/8 of an inch in from that first row of basting stitches. So let's put this on the sewing machine and get to stitching those basting rows. I have my machine on a straight stitch with the longest stitch length that I can do. And here we go. And my presser foot is 1/8 of an inch away from the needle. So I'm just gonna line up with that, drop my needle, and remember, no back stitching. And now it's really important that you do not stitch over your first row of stitching, because then you won't be able to gather it. Brought my skirt over to my table, and I'm going to take very carefully my basting threads, and I'm going to start pulling them. And I prefer to gather down more than I need to, and I try to be really careful to not break the thread, because then you gotta resew them and that sucks. So I prefer to gather down more than I need, and then I will adjust once I'm attaching it to the dress. I find it easier to evenly distribute these gathers when I make it smaller than it needs to be. When it's bigger than it needs to be, then I'm trying to accommodate for that in the gathers, and I just think it's easier to do it this way. So I have this way gathered down. You can see why I was so adamant about marking which piece is your front piece, because when everything's really gathered down, it's almost impossible to tell which is your front piece and which is your back piece. I did something a little bit different for the instructions of this dress. I gave you 2 different options of how you can attach the skirt to the bodice. There's version A and there's version B. Version A is easier, quicker, but does leave you with a raw edge that needs to be finished. Version B involves stitching in the ditch and perfectly sandwiching the raw gathered edge within the lining and the main bodice pieces. For my personal preference, I just use option A. No one is seeing the inside of this dress but me. So depending on your personality type, that will either drive you crazy or it's just fine. So I am a perfectionist in other ways, in ways where I feel like it counts. So for the sake of this tutorial, I am going to use version A, but the sewing pattern does have a version B if you are more of a fan of a totally concealed raw edge. It's also a little little bit more of an advanced technique, and that is why I prefer to go with version A. I think it's just a little bit more beginner friendly. So I'm going to do version A today, but if you ever find yourself feeling confused about version B, just shoot me an email and I can honestly walk you through the whole thing. So I have the bodice facing me, and I do have it upside down, and I have the front of the bodice facing me. I am also going to take my skirt, and you want to make sure that you have the wrong side of the skirt facing you, because these need to be right sides together. This is the front of my skirt, so this curve does match that curve, and I'm going to insert the bodice into the skirt. The sewing pattern instructions shows this kind of via an X-ray look, so if you're confused on what I'm doing, be sure to reference your sewing pattern. But I'm going to take the end of my bodice and I'm going to insert it into the skirt. I'm going to come up and out. And I like to start pinning by pinning my side seams and then working my way to the center. So this is the side seam of my skirt, and this is the side seam of my front bodice, and I'm going to pin all three of those layers together. And then I'm going to find my next side seam, and make sure you're pinning the right side seams and not your back center seam. So here's my next side seam, and I'm going to pin that to the side seam of the skirt. And things definitely look a little crazy right now, because remember, I did extra gathering. So now that I have those pinned, I can start to slowly and evenly start to stretch out my gathers. See, because we don't want anything like that. We need to get that a little better, flatter looking. And now I'm going to use a zigzag stitch all the way around the skirt, making sure that I am attaching all three layers. I always like to leave some freedom in my sewing patterns because I don't think that there is a specific one way to do anything. And I think at the end of the day, people just need to feel empowered in their projects, and you should be able to make choices that you want to make. So of course, the sewing pattern has recommendations of how you should sew things and all that good stuff, but ultimately, it's up to you what you do at the end of the day. So by example, now that I have the skirt attached to the bodice, I am left with this raw edge. You can trim up all your threads and leave as is if your fabric doesn't fray. If it does fray, you will want to finish this raw edge. But honestly, you can leave it as is if you want. And that is what's so awesome about sewing, is there is not just one way to do one thing. You can do it a bunch of different ways. So now I have my skirt and my bodice attached. And I just like to give everything a good check and make sure that everything is actually attached. Especially since we were working with so many different layers of fabric. I also feel very similarly about how you hem a project really comes down to personal preference. So if you want, you can finish this raw edge, turn it to the inside and stitch. You do have enough length to do a double fold hem, although I wouldn't recommend that with a really thick fabric. I think a thicker fabric, the machine will have a really hard time getting through that. So I am going to just finish this raw edge, turn up to the inside and stitch. And for this dress, I like a little bit of a wider hem. So I'm probably going to stitch about up here as opposed to something smaller like a 3/8 of an inch. And just give the skirt a nice trim before you hem it. You can also let it hang for about 24 hours just to make sure that all your fibers are nice and relaxed and that your hem doesn't grow while you are wearing the dress. I've got my raw edge finished and my hem all pinned in place. And I'm just going to stitch all the way around. And now that the hem is finished, let's go try it on. I really hope you all enjoyed sewing up this sewing pattern. I know I had a lot of fun making it and sewing it myself. As always, if you need any help, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will see you in the next one.